If you've heard data sharing is good for science, but you haven't done it yet and you're not quite sure where to start, then this talk is for you. So we'll talk about best practices for data sharing and cover lots of tips and tricks. And we'll also talk about concerns you might have about sharing. So my name is Esther Schott. I'm a PhD student at Concordia University, and me and my collaborators are researchers in infant development. So a lot of the examples that we're going to talk about will be from that field, but it applies to different fields of psychology as well. So data sharing not just encompassing the sharing of data, but also sharing of materials that you use for your study, analysis script that you use to generate the results, and any other components that are necessary to reproduce your research. And of course, data sharing is part of the larger envelope of open science practices that are set to improve the way we reach conclusions about the world. So let's start with why data sharing is good. So first of all, data sharing is very helpful in reproducing results so that you can make sure that your colleagues get the same results as you, but also data sharing is useful to do new analyses, so test out alternative hypotheses, find better ways of visualizing data maybe. And finally, data sharing is very useful to be better able to create meta-analyses. So oftentimes the information we share in a publication is not actually enough to include that paper in a meta-analysis, and so open data sharing is really, really useful for meta-analyses. These are kind of lofty, big goals, but there's also really concrete benefits to data sharing to researchers like you and I. So to explore these reasons why data sharing is good for us, I've assembled a scientific panel. So first I'd like to say hi to Dr. Tenure. So Dr. Tenure completed their PhD 10 years ago, and at that point, data sharing was not a common behavior. So now a keen graduate student approaches them about getting the data from their PhD thesis, and of course, Dr. Tenure first has to spend a lot of time preparing these data for sharing. So had data sharing been a common behavior at that time, that would have gone much, much faster. And then second, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Forgetful. Dr. Forgetful finished a research project a couple of years ago and now wants to do a follow-up analysis of that project. And as they're going back into these data, they're realizing, past Dr. Forgetful was not actually that good at documenting, so they have to spend a lot of time catching up and retracing their steps. So data sharing really forces you and I and everyone to really think about how they can best make the study accessible to people in the future. And finally, we have Mr. BSc. So Mr. BSc is an undergrad student who's going into grad school, and maybe they're from a university where there is a little bit less of a culture of doing human research, doing open science practices. So Mr. BSc can learn a lot from the way that others share their studies and do their studies. So all of these things are kind of more tangible benefits of data sharing. For each study, there's lots of things we could share, and we'll go into some of these later. But the point here is what specifically you're sharing depends on many things, including the type of study you're running, the ethics permission that you have for sharing, and of course, you and your collaborators. So now we'll walk through how data sharing fits into the research workflow. And we'll start from the beginning of the project, so before even you start collecting your data. So at that point, you can already start building your digital online repository. So many people are probably familiar with the Open Science Framework. So if you do a pre-registration, it already lives on the Open Science Framework. But even if you don't do a pre-registration, it's valuable to type up a brief study description for the repository. And then it's also useful at that point to think about how to share stimuli, so uploading the stimuli, and I will show you an example of that. So here is the OSF repository for one of my research projects. Here it has the title of the paper, and then as we scroll down, we see the collaborators, the abstract, and then we get down to the files. So I've shared the data analysis and scripts, the preprint, as well as the stimuli. And then when we look specifically at the stimuli, here there's a bunch of subfolders, but what's important here is eventually we get to the audio files, and in this case, the file names for the audio files are a little bit opaque. And that's why I've included a README here. So in the README, I explain what the file names mean, what the content of each file is, plus some extra information that is useful for somebody who wants to do the same study but in their own lab. And then, if possible, it's very useful to share the experimental program. So whatever the thing is that makes your study run in your lab, if there's a file that contains the parameters, the trials orders, and so on, that you can plug into a computer and then execute it, that's super useful. Plus, of course, the information of how to actually make it work in a different lab. So now we're moving on to when you're starting the data analysis, what to keep in mind then. So first of all, it's always important to think about variable names, but that's something that I often forget and then have to catch up at the end. So it's very, very beneficial to think about this very well at the beginning. So having consistent naming conventions, for example, all small capitalization or all underscores in your variable names. If you want more information about that, I really recommend this paper that walks through recommendations for data sharing. And also another thing is if you have categorical variables, and for example, gender, so male, female, non-binary, code them with the actual variable labels instead of using, for example, 1, 2, 3, and then add a legend, because that always adds an extra step and some uncertainty. So now we're moving on to when your manuscript is finalized. So at that point, you can, of course, upload the data. And so for uploading data, it's super, super important to upload it in a format that can be opened on any computer, regardless of the specialized software they're using. So the CSV file or comma-separated value file is super, super helpful for that. And one important addition to that is also including a data dictionary or code book. And we'll show you an example of that. So this is what one of the data files that I've shared on the OSF looks like when we look at it. So here's the variable names and then the values in my data set, but some of these variable names are not super descriptive. So for example, what does the test location here mean? So in order to find that out, we go to the code book, and here we see all of the variable names that we've seen in the previous data set, but we also find a label that really explains in plain English what's contained in here, the possible values, and whether it's text or numbers in that variable. And this particular thing was generated with the code book package, and that's a super useful way of creating these, but it can also be just created very basic in Excel. So for example, here we have the same thing, variable name, and then a description that can be super easily created. And now as we move to analysis scripts, one part that's very important is to share a description or include lots of comments and documentation with your analysis script. And here what's important is to explain why each step is done so that the reader can really follow along and see the sequence of events. When you're sharing your analysis scripts, it's important to include information about the program you're using to execute this and also version numbers, because sometimes or oftentimes an analysis that works on one computer doesn't necessarily work on another computer. So the version numbers are super important. there's one example that I'm going to show you for how to make your analyses really, really foolproof for sharing, and we'll go into that now. So this is a thing called a binder. It binds together your data, your analysis script into a virtual environment that can be opened via a link on any computer. So it means that regardless of the operating system, the version number of the local R, this will work on any computer, and it allows me to execute the script here and, for example, look at the plots. And if I wanted to make small changes to the script, I could and execute them right away without having to download and install a bunch of things. So this is a really cool thing, and I've linked an explanation workshop to that. And so finally, you can also share videos. That is super beneficial for other people to really be able to think through what does the study look like from the point of view of the child. But also it allows other researchers to talk about your research and promote your research in an accessible context, for example, in lectures. If you're sharing videos, a very useful resource is the Databrary website. And here it talks about policies and best practices, and that has lots of help to, for example, working with your ethics committee on allowing sharing of video files. And it also allows to host those video files so that other people can access them. So now we're at the final check. So at this point, we've uploaded all the data and information, and at this point, the only thing that's missing is to point the reader or the visitor to your repository to all of the information that's there, because if they don't know to look for that information, they won't find it. So here it's useful to give an overview of the project, give an overview of the kinds of programs that were used to create the study, and what the folders in your repository contain. So for example, the stimuli README could live right here and have all the explanations. And at this point, it's also very useful to recruit a buddy to help. So the question is kind of, can a naive person understand the file shared? And so for that, if you can ask a colleague to look through, that's super valuable, because often reviewers don't have the time to look through these online repositories. And finally, I want to highlight this review article if you want more information about any of the steps mentioned in here. This is a great paper for going through these in detail. So another thing that we've created for you to make it easier to share your data is this list of reminders for data sharing, where at the point where you're uploading or creating your repository, you can check off all of the things to make sure your data is as accessible as possible. And so finally, now we're at the section where we say, but what if, and talk about all our concerns. So first of all, you might be concerned about participant privacy. And for this, we've already highlighted resources like Databrary, but basically here the steps are to amend your consent form to allow certain kinds of sharing. And if you're working with special populations where it's really, really difficult to share data sets, you can look into sharing synthetic data. So this is data that mimics all of the properties of your original data set, but can be shared with the general public or with researchers. And then next point that you might be concerned about is, what if somebody finds mistakes in my script? And I understand that. That is a scary thing. But I also want to say that's okay. Science will be better off for finding them. And the important thing is to be transparent about these processes if that occurs. And then finally, you might be concerned about not having enough time. And so here I'll mention two things. One is, start with one new thing for each project. So maybe for the first one, you pick out just one or two things that you want to share and then add on for future projects. And then the other thing is that most likely you'll actually save time in the long run. So for example, when you go back to an old project and it's really nicely documented, you'll thank your past self. Or if somebody asks you for the data and you can just send off the link, that'll feel really nice. So finally, I want to say thank you. You can go to our OSF page to find all of the resources and links we've mentioned.